Hello and welcome to another episode of the Digital and Social Media Sports Podcast. I am your host, Neil Horwitz. Hit me up on Twitter, NJ287, also on LinkedIn, the website, dsmsports.net, the other website, slyke.co, and of course, follow the podcast on whichever podcast platform is your favorite. What an excellent show I have for you guys today. I've been wanting to talk to this guy for a while. I've been reading his work for years, and he is just full of good insight. If you work in sports, in sponsorship, in business, really any industry, you will really learn a lot from this episode. My guest on the podcast today is Adam Grossman. He is the founder and CEO of Block 6 Analytics. Block 6 was acquired by Excel and became Excel Analytics, where their Excel management is still using the technology and platform that Adam Grossman helped build. Today, he is a professor at Northwestern's Master's in Sports Administration program, where he teaches the leaders of tomorrow. Great opportunity for students there. He's also a co-author of the book, The Sports Strategist, Developing Leaders for a High-Performance Industry. Adam is a super accomplished guy, so smart, and able to really articulate really complex ideas but also actionable insights that can really help you be better at your job, and just so much information. Here he is, Adam Grossman. I am back on the podcast with today's guest, and I'm so excited to have this conversation. We've already been geeking out a little bit before we started recording. My guest on the podcast today is Adam Grossman. He is founder and CEO of Block 6 Analytics, also a professor at Northwestern in the Master's Sports Administration program, and also an author. We'll talk about his book a little bit too, co-author of the book, The Sports Strategist, Developing Leaders for a High-Performance Industry. Adam, you're so dang accomplished, and you're still a young man. Welcome to the podcast today.
Well, thank you. Not as young as I used to be, but appreciate appreciate the comment.
None of us are, but this industry will keep you young a little bit. You have to stay on top of all the new trends, and you being with students as well will keep you young as well. So it's all good.
Yeah, no, well, glad to be here.
So psyched to learn from you. You are this is a space that affects all of us in the greater sports and certainly the digital and social industry. And you are so knowledgeable and great, have great experience. But before we get into the meat of our discussion, Adam, tell us about your career path. All your stops along the way. Any tips for folks that want to try to do what you do?
Yeah, so I started off, I had an idea. So I was the founder and CEO of Block 6 Analytics, as you said. I came up with the idea for Block 6 Analytics in between my first and second year of business school, where I was working for the Washington Capitals before it was part of Monumental Sports and Entertainment. The Capitals and Monumental was then and are now a progressive team in the sports industry. They identified a need for a cross-channel kind of sponsorship valuation. I actually originally recommended that they should work with somebody to find it. I mentioned that directly to the CMO. CMO's basic response was, why isn't this something you come up with yourself as part of like a school project? It's not exactly what he said. This is a little bit stylized, but that's ended up happening. To your point about how do you get involved in the sports industry, I just kind of took advantage of this opportunity to come up with what ended up being the starting point of a cross-channel company-specific valuation model that we ended up using for Block 6 Analytics. The Capitals didn't end up being the first client, but it was kind of the catalyst for me to develop the basis for the company. In addition to that, kind of the idea behind the valuation model was, particularly since I was at business school at the time, was take kind of a more traditional asset valuation approach used by private equity, investment banks, venture capital, institutional capital, and apply it directly to the sports industry, particularly given that sports sponsorships are considered assets, but from my perspective, weren't appropriately valued as assets. I ended up building up the business, adding in some new platforms that leveraged artificial intelligence, particularly computer vision and natural language processing. Built up the business, both working with teams, but primarily with brands and agencies. Sold the business to Excel Sports Management in 2021. Worked at Excel for a couple years, and then left Excel in December of 2023. During that time, I also became a professor at Northwestern, as you mentioned, and then co-authored a book and wrote chapters in other books and then articles, like you mentioned, whether John Wall Street and other publications. The reason I go through all that, again, to your point, one of the ways that I've been able to differentiate myself in the sports industry, and not everybody can do this. I'm not saying this is, one, you don't have to start your own company to do that, but two, creating content, particularly from my perspective, more long form content that shows how I can think and consider and examine different ideas, has been a very good way to show some of the ways that either Block 6 is differentiated or my perspective is differentiated in the industry.
Heck yeah, yeah. I mean, I've learned a lot from reading your stuff, and it's always super insightful and a demonstration of your knowledge, and it comes from it's well earned, as you just explained with your impressive background. And I mean, first off, I'm just blown away by the fact that like you're a relatively young kid out of business school, and it's like I have an idea, I'm gonna do this thing, and you had the ambition and the drive to not just do it, but kick it out of the park, so to speak, or knock it out of the park. My analogies get mixed.
Yeah, I mean, again, as I guess relatively young, obviously now with a lot of both then and now, there's definitely younger people than me that started companies and started more
Yeah,
successful
yeah,
companies
yeah.
like Six was. But and now it's a little different. I have a young family where when I started Block Six, I did not have a family, so that made it easier. I also started Block Six or came up with the original idea and right when the financial crisis, particularly between 2008 and 2010. So there's
Mhm.
because there were somewhat fewer jobs, there was somewhat less of an opportunity cost of starting a business. I also was able to work a consulting job while I was getting Block Six off the ground, which was helpful, particularly in terms of financing Block Six, but also helping to support my, kind of day-to-day life.
Yeah.
So that, I had some idiosyncratic things that were helpful. And like I said in the introduction, starting a business is not for everybody. It's definitely very hard. It's very challenging. There's certainly a lot of positive payoffs. That's why people do it, but there's a lot of negatives and a lot of things you have to really think about. So it's like I said, you don't need to start your own business to enter in the sports industry. It's not always even the most
Right.
compelling thing to do or the right thing to do, but obviously I think it ended up being a very good experience for me overall.
So what did sponsor? I mean, this is going to be a broad question, but I want to kind of give you the opportunity to inform me a bit and teach me. What was the state of sponsorship valuation and data and analytics when you were starting Block Six, when you were with the Capitals, and was it was it cross platform, cross channel already? Like how was stuff being measured, or was it still just like old school, whatever, back of the napkin rate cards from the 70s?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would even, some of that, I'm both surprised at how far, or not surprised. I'm happy about how far the industry has come, and also there's a lot of room and runway to go. Even what you're talking about, so the primary way is still rate card valuations. That is still definitely the primary way things are valued today. And rate card valuations are typically valued on some form of reach metric or quantity metric, which is basically how many people saw something multiplied times it's typically called cost per thousand impressions or CPM rate. So yeah, if you multiply impressions times how many people saw it times the price per thousand impressions, that's typically what the price point is. From my perspective, though, there is several inefficiencies in the market, particularly when I started the business. One of the things that you learn in business school, in business school or undergraduate business courses, is something called a discounted cash flow model. And one of the insights from a discounted cash flow model is that different assets can have different values to different companies based on their business models. So it's really how does an asset generate in a discounted cash flow model? How does an asset generate cash for a business? So one example that I like to use, one of our clients at Block Six, and now still a client, I believe, at Excel, is Under Armour. If Under Armour builds a factory, they can make apparel, right? They make clothes, shorts, shirts, if a bank like Citibank was one of our clients, what is Citibank going to do with a factory, right? It really has no real use case for it other than to, try to financialize it or securitize it in some form. So like that's just why would, Citibank want to build a factory versus like there's a very clear reason that Under Armour wants to build a factory. Citibank also, while it definitely has a retail business, also has an enterprise business, and there are a lot of companies. One of the clients that Excel Analytics had was Paycor, which is an enterprise human resources technology company. Again, if Paycor were to build a factory, what was it going to do with it? Also, the goal of Paycor is potentially to reach enterprise customers, in addition to larger customers in the area. But the idea is, if you're not able to reach a enterprise customer, or having a reach-based model where having a reach-based model where, a lot of the people are never going to buy your product, is that really the right way of doing things? Or can there be adjustments made to the model to show the value based on the ability to reach the right people at the right time with the right message? So I would still say actually the most fundamental thing that is done is again reach or quantity times CPM. And there's definitely a reason to do that. But the idea of specific companies and different companies even getting different values from the same assets is still something that I don't think is as fully developed as it could be in the industry today.
How does that, I guess, play out for the folks on the other side, whether it's the agencies who are representing these brands or the people themselves working to secure sponsorships and secure assets? Like, do they want to see a rate card that they know that the company down the street, whatever that company does, is going to be charged the same amount that they would be? Or do they appreciate that there's I don't mean to use this as a pejorative, but discriminatory pricing based on the value of the asset to them as a business?
Yeah, it really depends. So like it depends on, I mean, it's definitely easier to use a rate card based off of a CPM based metric and using some standardized if you're going to scale or use some kind of discriminant or variable pricing, that it's the same for all the companies. That's definitely the easier approach, and it's understandable why people go that route. And that's traditionally how things have been done. There are definitely companies who, again, if they're looking at, if you can say something is built specifically for their business, what we have found, and we found at Block Six, and I think it's still true what we found at Block Six, and I think it's still largely true in the industry, is like if you can tell me specifically why something is valuable to me, not valuable generally, then I'm willing to pay more, right?
Yeah.
So like I'm willing to pay more and I'm willing to sell it for more. That may be more work, but it's if you can communicate in a language that my decision makers, particularly the CEO, CMO, CFO, board of directors, senior executives, can understand, that's really helpful. It's also been there had been more of a transformation outside of sports, particularly advertising and generally, particularly digital advertising. There has been a more of a transition to performance marketing, whether that's Google, Facebook, where you could actually see are people clicking on the ads and are they going to the website or are they making a purchase? Some of that has been dissipated as Apple changed some of its tracking rules, which you're probably more familiar with even than I am. But like the idea is like that some of that has been more difficult to more clearly see, but clearly sports has been more focused on the top of the funnel, while digital marketing has been more closely related, particularly from a performance metrics perspective, closer to the bottom of the funnel. And I think there should be a more of a convergence. Not that top of the funnel isn't important; it's definitely important, but there has to be more directly a correlation to revenue generation, company specific metrics, and the ability to make those insights actionable across. You even mentioned this before, which I don't think I specifically talked about, but how do you compare things across multiple platforms? Like, how do you compare somebody going to a game and watching it for 2 hours versus somebody seeing a 1 to 3 second ad on Facebook, seeing a display ad? Like, you have to be able to create a language around that. It is difficult to do, and it's again something that we spent a lot of time at Block Six and Excel doing, but it's something that I think is worth being done.
Yeah, no, for sure. My previous life, from a previous job, at least, I was in the mobile app space, and one of the things we started to try to sell these early days was the sponsorship of the launch screen, essentially, like the logo that you would see every time you launch that app, and we knew exactly how many times that was launched, how many times people like it was on their phone right in front of their face. You compare that against maybe some physical signage at a stadium that everyone who walks in the stadium is going to see in theory, maybe, and they're probably going to see it a ton of times. Every time they look up, they're going to see that logo again. And then you have your social media sponsorship where you might have like a starting lineup graphic that every fan is going to see on game days. And so it is a matter of like understanding that people that are seeing that signage in a stadium and is there a diminishing rate of returns every time they look up and see that logo, or every game they come to? Like how do you start to compare those impressions across those channels and come up with some sort of like, what's kind of like the methods of the madness, the formula that helps to marry those things?
Yeah, I mean, there's different approaches. I think there's some um, even when you're talking about repeated viewings, like, right, I mean, some of it is like there is definitely some evidence that there is some diminishment over time, particularly if you see something repeatedly, whether it's an ad or even just a sign.
It
In
could be
in
stronger too,
general,
though, of course. I'm sure there's also could be an increasing rate of returns because you're going
well,
to be
that's what I
changing.
said. I think maximizing the probability. I mean, when you're talking about maximizing the probability of success, particularly from sponsorship or advertising consumption, it's part of that is like what is the probability that somebody saw it, and that's what part of what the kind of the baselining is you do baseline like from a time perspective, is time an important variable? And how do you say like you're more likely to see something if you're there or seeing it for a long period of time? There's a value to that. There's value to like, there is value to the quantity, but what I thought worked well is a version of quantity, quality, and in quantity, quality, and engagement, right? How many people saw something? Are these, from a quality perspective, are these the right people? Like I said, the right people at the right time receiving the right message that drives the revenue and brand behaviors that you're looking to do. So like, right, if you're talking about an app, and you're talking about the screen, that you're much more, if you're much closer down the funnel than somebody seeing a sign, and your primary goal is customer acquisition or revenue generation or increasing the lifetime value of that customer, maybe that should be more valuable, right? And can be more valuable, and that should be reflected in the overall model than somebody seeing a sign, right? So you have to account for these things. And then from an engagement perspective, right, how long did somebody or how many people kind of interacted with a piece of content, or kind of are you fishing where the fish are, right? So like, is the channel that you're in the right channel to be in? Because you could have the most effective ad in the world, but if that's not where your audience is, that's problematic. So if you really looked at it from a quantity, quality, and engagement perspective, and then one of the key insights that we had from the model, and comes from like a discounted cash flow model that I mentioned earlier, is if you don't focus on what an asset is, but you focus on what an asset does, then you can more easily make those comparisons. Because this isn't necessarily a digital sign or a mobile app placement or an in-venue activation. It is doing these things. And if you look at how it's doing these things and you say doing these things has this impact on the business, then it's more easy to make those comparisons.
Love that. Yeah, I mean, something I like to say a lot is not all impressions are created equally, and like, and
That is something I've said many times as well.
yeah, and similarly too, I think maybe the next level of that these days is the word engagement. It's a very loaded word now. It can mean a lot of things, especially in the social media world. A lot of formulas are just broken down to cost per engagement and value per engagement, and I think there's also another kind of principle is the difference between advertising and activation, sponsorship, and I think if you think about the being at a game, for example, you might have someone who is the name right sponsor of the stadium, even, or a major billboard, and you have someone who is giving away a car on the through a sweepstakes, and you see the car on the field, or maybe it's an activation where it's a half court shot, and there's actually something to see, or you're seeing a product in action as well. So, like, how do you think about like when you think about the value of an asset or an activation and engagement? Like, is there a difference, or what's that scale look like of I have an advertisement that associates me and people know what I do as a brand? Like maybe it's the drive of the game brought to you by Chevy. Then you have the more of an act, seeing the product in action. It's the you have an interview with a coach in the Chevy in the car, like driving to the game. You get to see the car in action, and then you just have your straight up ad. Like, how do you start? What are the sort of scientific data driven ways, excuse me, to start to assess the true value of all that, and to make sure you're getting the proper value for it that's going to the partner?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the way we used to do it is you could look at it from a more qualitative or more quantitative perspective, right? It is from a qualitative perspective, again, what are the actual objectives of the brand? Because you could say from like a purely economic perspective, you could say like, look, if you do something like, have somebody drive on the field that's directly addressing your target audience in a way that like, look, if they download, they see the ad where they see what's happening and then they make a purchasing decision because that's the right customer. That's what you're trying to do. That's like the most maximally efficient, use of advertising dollars.
Yeah.
You could say though, like your goal as a company is to say, well, we actually have either a lot of or substantial saturation with a particular demographic, or customer type. Our goal is actually to expand our customer base. So we're going to be somewhat inefficient in reaching these customers because that is explicitly our stated goal.
Yeah.
So that's one way you could say like, well, you have to factor that into the model. Again, if each of these asset types are all the things that goes back to what my original kind of contention is like, you don't look at what they are, you look at what they do, right? So you're actually agnostic potentially from a perspective of this is doing this in terms of like, this is a sign versus this is a demonstration of the car's capabilities. You would say that a demonstration of the car's capabilities is more likely to drive customer acquisition, and customer acquisition is relatively speaking worth X dollars more than brand awareness. And if you quantify what does customer acquisition mean to a revenue generation, what does customer retention, what does employee retention, what does brand awareness, what is brand perception, what is brand favorability, whatever the metrics are you're using, and what does that translate into your core metrics, which are typically, your number one metric usually is year over year sales growth. Now, some people want to factor in profitability. We focus on top line revenue because it's hard for the partner, particularly the rights holder, to be able to, pull the levers on profitability metrics, particularly things that they have no control over. One of the things you do have, right, you're saying we're working with you to maximize revenue generation. How do these assets maximize revenue generation? So how do each part of the activation map onto either customer acquisition, customer retention, employee retention, or whatever, again, whatever metric, lifetime customer value, whatever metric you're using, click-through rates, view-through rates. There's a lot of different things you could use on a performance metric or revenue generation perspective. You map on what the activation does to what its intended use is, and then you could see the value. One of the things we also you also can do is to say you can use both potentially like a predictive and descriptive way of looking at the advertising. You could say, this is what we expected to have happen. This is what we are paying for. This is what actually happened. So if something happened above and beyond what you predicted to happen, that would add incremental value to the partnership because you're doing something, you're getting incremental value, and that's good. That's what you're hoping for is incremental value. But if it doesn't perform or underperforms, then obviously you're not getting as much value as anticipated. So one of the things, like if you're just using a straight CPM formula, that doesn't take into, you're getting what you paid for, but that doesn't necessarily say if there's overvalue created because the asset over delivered based on what you expected.
I mean, you can still have, I imagine, CPMs overperform though. You expected whatever 10 million impressions, you got 20 million.
Oh yeah, you could still do that. I'm just saying, like, how do you establish that baseline? But it's also right. Then it's only based on reach, right? It's only based on like we got 10 million, then this is the CPM, and this is what we thought was going to happen. So like it did, but did it actually like, sometimes you can reflect this in, did it reach your performance goals? Did it reach your revenue goals?
Right.
Did you get more activations than you anticipated? And it's also like if you just look at impressions, like why is it actually over delivering? You're also not necessarily all your if right if you don't look at quality and engagement, you're just saying, well, more people saw it. Well, like, yeah, I know that. I mean, it's got more impressions. Like, what else beyond that? Is this, is it a good, is it getting to people in the right way? Is it getting to people, where they're taking the actions that you want? Is it getting in ways that you can go back and say these types of actions are either directly causing or correlated to revenue generation or whatever the key metrics you're looking at? The more clarity you have around that beyond more people saw it, the better.
Totally. Yeah, I want to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of social and sports in particular because that's such a hot topic always. When we're trying to get better. But I also want to talk briefly, real quick, about just the level of, I guess, first off, the availability of data to make these more robust, valuation models and measurement formulas, and also the level of collaboration that you see. So if I have whatever, one of my players is going to do a meet and greet at the car dealership, or we're focused on cars today for some reason. At the car dealership, and we think that's going to lead to test drives and probably lead to some purchases. And is it on the dealership to then cooperate kind of and kind of give that data back and say, oh yeah, here's what we expected, here's what the results were, and we had a couple of sales down the line that equaled to $80,000 in revenue, whatever. Like, is that kind of collaboration happening, or is that the partner of the car dealership still kind of holding their data back and not necessarily sharing everything to complete that picture for the team?
Yeah, I mean, this is one area that has developed a lot, both in terms of the number of point solution offerings that can provide you with data that you don't have to necessarily be reliant on the end user, the customer, but also that there is an openness because, particularly from the company side or brand side or even agency side, there's an openness to share that data because they want it to be effective. I mean, if you're spending the money, you want it to be effective. And if you want to show how effective it can be, you do want to integrate data sources when you can. And there is an openness to sharing more data sources. So you should mention a car dealer example. Stellar Algo on its website. So Stellar Algo is a first-party data company that it looks at multiple, tries to create, basically what's called a CDP or a customer data platform where you can integrate multiple different, zero-party, first-party, third-party data sets to really understand who your fans are across multiple different attributes. They did actually run one of the case studies they have on their website is an actual campaign they ran with Toyota that showed that exactly what you're saying. And they were able to work with Toyota to get that information through one of the partnerships that they facilitated. So that's just a very clear example of something like that happening. On the flip side, there are companies like Sports Innovation Lab and PwC and a bunch of other kind of third parties that are tracking transaction data, particularly through credit card data. So then you're also able to see transaction data and append your data sets with transaction data from these companies. It's a non-trivial task to take transaction data and categorize it by specific sports audiences and to really, isolate it even by potential teams or potential properties. But that does eliminate potentially the need for you to work, particularly if you're working directly with a property, that you don't necessarily have to work with the brand if they're not your client explicitly. You can get some of that purchasing data. There's publicly available data. And like I said, there are point solution providers, particularly in terms of tracking the overall value of the sponsorships. There's many different, media analytics companies that you can work with, which you're probably familiar with. But whether it's the Zooms, the Blink Fires, I know the trajectories, Relos, and there's a lot of different data providers. The real trick is pulling that, or I shouldn't say the real trick. One of the key value adds, and that's one of the reasons that Block Six was successful. And I think Excel Analytics still would largely be successful, is the integration of all these different data sources, because that's at the end of the day, the end user, whether that's the property, the brand, or the agency, is saying like, well, how valuable is my sponsorship? You have to potentially integrate data, and potentially you could look at 50 plus different companies that could provide data sources for a model. So working with people who can say this is actually what's going on, and this is performing because we've integrated all these data sets to get a single source of, say, like, you got this amount of value, this return on investment, here's why that's happening. We can drill into detail. That's really valuable. But I do think like the explosion of data and the amount of data that's available and working with different data partners to integrate that data has it definitely increased since I started Block Six.
And how granular can we or even should we try to think about the ROI of sponsorships when they are so multifaceted oftentimes, where you have a whatever a children's hospital is going to get signage at the game. They're going to get a video made when players go and visit the kids at the hospital. They're going to get some social media love. They're going to like you might have some overall results that are produced and outcomes that are produced. How do you start to, or should you even try to say, well, it was this asset that drove this much value, and this asset drove this much value? Is that just a
Yeah, I
fool's?
mean, I think you should get as granular as possible. I mean, that was, the original conceit of Block Six was to look at it on a line item, asset by asset basis, and then kind of make those apples to apples comparisons so you could optimize spend from a brand perspective, and then also go back to, if you're a rights holder or a property, you could say these are what's working explicitly, and we're going to sell you more of these assets because they are working. I think the more information you can have, the better. With the caveat being, right, obviously you're kind of getting to it or alluding to it. Sports partnerships can have 50, 75, 100 different activation elements to it. That's a lot to deal with. So you really need to surface the most value add. And there definitely are some of our clients who just wanted the top line numbers. There's some clients who are like, oh, like what we used to call like inventory versus activation elements. Like, what are the higher level inventories items that are generating value? And then some people really do want like on a granular basis. So it really depends on the customer type. But yeah, I mean, the default is like, can we do it on an asset by asset basis? Can we compare assets? And really, what ends up being more important is not even on an asset by asset basis. Well, I shouldn't say that. That is definitely important, but it's how do I compare my sports sponsorship to my media sponsorship to my paid advertising? Like, we're not just only focused on sports. And again, the ability to make those cross comparisons because you have all the detail you need is really valuable.
Let's touch on that briefly. And Adam, I'm just going all over the place. I don't think I looked at my questions or notes once because this is so awesome. And you mentioned about like looking across at your alternative ways to spend your sponsorship money, media or advertising money, media dollars or sports. Is there a halo or an extra premium on sports because of the emotional element of it, because of maybe some of the fan data that we have? Like, is it basically still just like dollars in, dollars out?
Well, what I would say, just in terms of like, this was a good question. It's a question we used to get a lot at Block Six or Excel. Is this intangible nature? Like, people just, care more about sports. What I'd like to say in general is, to your point, it's not dollars in, dollars out, but where's the data that shows that, right? That is definitely a gut or intuitive feeling. And we would show that it could be true, right? It definitely could be true that people care about teams, leagues, events, athletes more than other asset types, but you want to create metrics that show that's true so you
Yeah.
can actually prove it out in some kind of quantifiable way. And again, not saying people's intuitions are wrong. I mean, a lot of times, particularly sports industry experts have really good intuition about what works and doesn't work, and that it usually is backed up by the data. But there are times there are counterintuitive insights. I actually just wrote a paper or a column for John Wall Street that looked into this concept a little
Yeah.
more. And
Okay.
it's just like, you want to be prepared for, you want to be able to use data to find some of these counterintuitive insights. And the reason they do pop out is because they're unexpected and don't typically happen. But like, in order for a counterintuitive insight to occur, you have to have some kind of benchmark that you're using. And it goes back to this intangible. People are just saying or buying things because they're intangible. It's like, well, you say it's intangible. Like, how do I know that that's true? Like, it's hard to do that unless you can actually say like why that's true. And whether that's using quantitative, you can never use qualitative reasoning for that, but just like some kind of systematic quantitative and qualitative reasoning to show the benefit of the intangible nature of sports, I think is the best path forward.
Yeah, I mean, you see, I think NASCAR is one of the best in this, where like their fans are this much more likely to consider a brand just because they are a sponsor of NASCAR and no other reason at all. All things being equal, and I think I love those kind of stories. I want to touch too. Like, I mean, I'm old in this space myself, and early on, I think I joked in my notes I sent to you early on, before our interview, is social media sponsorships were a virtual throw-in, and that might even be being kind. It was we are doing all this other stuff, and yeah, we'll throw you a couple Facebook posts. And it was that was it. That was literally the email, or like sometimes it was copy and paste this straight ad and throw it on Facebook because we're getting $0 for it. And now you turn around and it's I mean, I don't want to say complete opposite, but you have these valuations that are placed on these sponsorship assets within social and some of the different ways you can activate. And you even have the Zoom, Splinkfires, MVP indexes, trajectories of the world you can go to a partner and say, according to this formula, based on the numbers from last year, this asset is worth this much money. And sometimes it's some outsized metrics like, don't ask me what a Leo Messi post is worth on Instagram or a LeBron James post or Kim Kardashian post, whatever it might be. So like, how has that played out in reality of going from virtual zero cost to some these mind-blowing numbers? And is it actually capturing the value appropriately? And are sponsors willing to pay that? And are we past the point of kind of questioning the value of social media sponsorships? And that's kind of
Well,
maybe
definitely not past. Yeah, yeah. I don't think we're past the point of questioning the value. I think that's a direct question: is are some of those values accurate, whether it's social media or media valuations generally? There's I wrote an article. I think this was before I was working directly with Corey, just about particularly during COVID, about the value of NFL tarps and kind of like this idea that you're expecting to get 5 times the media value of the cost. Well, there's a fundamental question. It's, these obviously people who work in sports are not stupid. Like they're either, so why are they selling something for 5 times less the cost? Either they are so stupid that they can't sell something for something that's worth 5 times more than what you're paying for it, or it's not worth that, right? And there's these valuation inflation metrics that can be problematic. That's saying, why are you selling something for this if you're saying it's worth this? And the more you can get to what I would consider to be a fair market asset value, or something that says it actually is worth this, not the media value is this, that can help make a transaction market more fluid because everybody's speaking the same language and the prices are much more aligned with what the value creation are. That being said, I think your original point is accurate. I mean, anytime there's new technology, typically the new technology, and you were saying about social media, I mean, that happened for digital. I mean, you were talking about apps, like digital app download, like those things all were throw-ins until people saw them as valuable ways to communicate or engage with their customers, and then they become more and more valuable. So that's a natural kind of, you'll probably see that increasing, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether that's generative AI or otherwise. There are ways that will, be either start out maybe as lower cost or free advertising or partnership units that probably become potentially more and more valuable. I would say like in terms of the actual value, I think one of the things that, one of the key insights, and this is not surprising, I think it's pretty, fairly intuitive, is that, social media posts on their own, sometimes they have large reach, but they don't have a lot of engagement, right? So like organic content by influencers, either user-generated content, influencer-driven content, or content from athletes, either from an owned or earned perspective. The one that does best is organic. So if an athlete or, particularly an athlete, if an athlete likes something and they talk about it organically, or seemingly organically, that's going to do better. So brands, just like you don't need to always work, there are definitely times you should work with Lionel Messi, Taylor Swift, or the biggest, that definitely makes sense. And there's definitely value being created. I just put a post up on LinkedIn, which is link back to what I wrote about in an analysis of Super Bowl ads. Like there are definitely times that Super Bowl ads work and are worth way more than even the $8 million per 30 seconds that they're being charged. That at least companies are reportedly paying Fox for this year's Super Bowl. But there are definitely times that it's not true. And it's like, again, if you go back to the company specific business goals that we talked about and objectives, there are times it works, there are times it doesn't work. You should definitely have look at social media spend, but it really can be really valuable and really effective. And when it is really valuable and effective, again, you want to have the language that shows how and why that's the case.
Yeah, no, and all this is not dancing around, but certainly stating that some of the main points is what is it worth to the brand, to the partner, to the sponsor, and don't just fall back necessarily on EMV, on equivalent media value, which has been kind of a crutch, I think, in the space for a long time because we know it. We know it's got this many impressions. We know the
Yeah,
CPM
right.
to buy that same ad, and therefore this is the value of that when it's not telling the full story. So when I'm like working for a team and I'm putting together different social media assets for a sponsor. And maybe I'm oftentimes probably reskinning something for a sponsor. Like it could be the premier plays of the game brought to you by Lexus, who has premier cars, or maybe it's the clean plays of the game brought to you by some cleaning brand. My examples are terrible right now. But like when we are creating these kind of a chicken before the egg, I guess sometimes you are just reskinning something that already an existing asset that already exists for a brand, and maybe just using a clever pun to make it relevant, versus something that's more involved or more custom, more bespoke. When we're thinking about creating these things, are we thinking about like let's go for the biggest numbers? That's ultimately what's going to make the brand happy. Should we be going down the full path to see is this pun going to be effective for this partner? Or is there a better way to activate this? I think I'm trying to figure out the best way to phrase this or articulate this thought of we have so many built-in assets within sports that are easy to add a logo to or make it relevant for a given industry based on a pun. But is there a better way to go about it to maximize the value or even to understand how we can create more value?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say there, in one of the things you just said, right? It's like, should we just show the brands that more people watched it because that's what they're looking for? Like I said, I don't know if that's fundamentally, that is definitely a lot of times the case, but not always the case. I think what you're talking about, there are certain things that do work, right? And if your goal is to maximize reach and engagement, there's definitely content that does work. Sometimes it's happy birthdays to a specific player or player introductions or score updates. Like those are things that people want to see, right? They definitely want to see that. They engage with that type of content. If your brand is there, it's more likely, and your goal is to maximize reach, particularly with the fans of a particular team, that works or can work. And that's when you can use that content. If your goal is to reach a specific audience, particularly like a subset of fans or a subset of specific people, then right, creating content that's geared towards a subset of fans or a subset of people, or potentially if you're a B2B company and you want to reach other partners that are part of that team,
Yeah,
how do you create content that resonates with those other partners rather than the fans specifically? Or if your goal is to maximize employee retention, well, do you create there's certain things that you would do to maximize employee retention because maybe your employees are much bigger fans of the team than the vice versa. Then the customers are maybe fans aren't as much customers as employees are fans of your team, and that makes more sense than to activate around. So again, by understanding what the goals and objectives are for a brand, that's where you can really start to customize those assets and make those kind of turn the keys, turn the levers on specific types of activations. The other thing we haven't really covered, and which is important for a lot of these partnerships, is community, right? Particularly from an employee retention, but also from a customer development or brand awareness. And sports teams have a lot of the capability to create customized community assets and have large, engagement with their local communities in ways that are difficult and ways A that communities care about, but B are different than other, kind of advertising opportunities that exist. And that's another way you can differentiate yourself. So again, by understanding the objectives of the company and taking the time to do that, you can maximize the value of those assets.
yeah. No, I love all this, and there's a whole other rabbit hole we can go down probably in the sports space with the globalization of sports as well and the opportunities with international. And we'll touch on that in a moment, but I also want to just briefly just talk about how I guess on the social front in particular, or even digital, I guess in general, you have a little more growth now in O&O and people prioritizing, hey, we're doing a lot on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, TikTok, whatever, YouTube. But there's also an opportunity for us to get more access to that first party data. I mean, and the social platforms will give you some demographic data as well. But what does that premium look like when you have a truly, I'm going to call it connected audience, especially as we see, connected apps grow in terms of TV viewing. You actually know for real who is watching and not just some,
Yeah.
Nielsen, or broad demographics. So is there a reason for that to really prioritize these own platforms that a fan who's signed in on your app consuming the same content that they're watching on Instagram, is that impression engagement worth more because you know exactly who that fan is, you can track their whole lifetime journey?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer, again, I hate saying this, it really depends. Like the most common example is like CPG brands have built their whole companies around particularly television spend, right? And how they can reach a broad audience because that's their goal is to reach a broad audience because their goal is to sell a large amount of product, and a large volume of product, typically at a lower price point, reaching a large audience at scale, particularly through sports media, which is, in a down year is 70 of the top, or what ended up being like
Right.
72 or 73 of the
Mass
top
audience.
100 television programs. That is really important to them. So maximizing reach is really important to them, and they have all different types of demographics that buy their products. So that really is, getting maximizing reach and scale is really important. We talked about this a little bit off or before the podcast, but one of the reasons that Meta was so valuable is exactly the reason you said. Well, there are certain companies who really do want us to target a specific demographic,
Yeah.
and it can be a waste of their dollars to target demographics who are never going to buy it, or not just demographic, but a lot of other audience profile information that you can put together to really target the specific consumer you're trying to target. That is increasingly valuable to companies. So it really depends. Like, is your goal to reach a specific audience? Is it reach a large audience? And then what are you actually trying to do, right? Digital platforms, if there's display ads, or even, in YouTube, there's pre-roll, mid-roll, after videos, like, do people watch the video to completion? Like, there's a lot of different variables you could look at, and things are priced in different ways based on where they are located. Um, I would say generally, yes, that's part of the obviously the compelling nature of whether it's connected TVs, digital advertising. The more granular data that you have, the better. And why digital marketing is more transitioned to performance marketing to say you're reaching the right people with the message that you're trying to do to drive the action. You can see the result. They're clicking on the links, they're going to the website. You're able to track, particularly when cookies were obviously still are prevalent. Like if you could track their behavior and track their customer journey across multiple websites, or even as Salesforce or other kind of CRM solutions come online where you're able to track more directly, yes, that should improve your overall advertising effectiveness. But it doesn't mean you don't want the assets that are more traditional assets. You just have to say, like, that's why I think it is important to make those comparisons across multiple different channels. Is where is your audience? What are you actually trying to target? Or what are you actually trying to accomplish? Who are you trying to target? Are you reaching the right audience,
Yeah.
both on the size and, from a quantity and quality perspective? So it really depends. And that's the whole point. It's like if there was a one size answer, then you could make a simpler potentially approach to
Right.
valuation. It just really depends on the company.
Yeah, the way that people oftentimes break it down in a very simplistic way is like Facebook's where all the olds are, TikTok's where all the kids are, Instagram's where the
Yeah, but I
millennials
mean, even
are.
that's like right. But even that, like you could say, like that's where they are. But like, is that really true? And like, but Facebook could
Right.
also deliver. Hey, Facebook has obviously a universe. Like you could go to Instagram and go on Reels or whatever, and they could push the needle. But like, there's Meta has a universe, but they also could deliver. Like that might be the perception, but that's what we're talking about. Like on a gut instinct quality. Like people have perceptions of what all these things do, but is that really true? Or could you
Right.
reach an older audience on TikTok or a younger audience on Facebook? Is it actually more cost efficient because people don't think that's true? And so
Right.
like you could actually create there's an actually potentially an arbitrage opportunity on these different platforms. So like that's the idea. Yeah, I mean, so like you just have to be careful about some of that stuff. Not that again, your intuition is probably true. I mean, maybe that's largely true, but there's ways that you can, create opportunities to add
Yeah,
value.
and the teams and leagues should know themselves too. Like they have the exact
Right.
demographics of who their audience is on each given platform. And
That's another thing. Actually, that is interesting. It's properties you would think, but that's not always true either. Like properties may have some information about their fans, but there's other providers who provide more information than they have on their own. It's not clear what information they do or do not have. So, like again, generally that can be true, but I wouldn't make that assumption that necessarily that teams know everything about their fans. And that's where again, where companies, like either like Block Six or other companies that we've talked about on this can really add value.
yeah, you can about identity solution platforms and all that as well that can add so many layers. I want to touch briefly, just a minute or two left here with Adam Grossman. Just enjoying this conversation so much, man. And that is sort of the feels, like the affinities, and like whether it's based on how a team is performing, and also just like the way that an association with a team can lead someone to have that same positive association with a brand as well. So I mean, I guess like I want to touch on just how does value fluctuate just based on like how if a team had a winning season or a losing season, and like does that really come into play quite a bit if a team has a losing season but still drives a lot of impressions, and I know you wrote about this recently in John Wall Street to some degree. um how much does that fluctuate, and are there steps that teams should be proactively taking to combat when a team is losing, and also to maximize and capitalize when a team is winning?
Yeah, I mean, the last thing is what you said is the recommendation that we usually provide is particularly if you work on the business side of sports. So to like what we talk about in the book is there's a break between the team operation and the business operations. Those should work more closely together, but they often don't. But typically if you're working on the business operation side, you have little to no impact on the team operation. Which players are being signed, which coaches you're hiring, who's the general manager, those types of things. You really have little to no impact typically on those decisions. So like you as a business operator, if you are dependent on winning to drive success, you are dependent on something outside of your control to drive your success, and that is not a good place to be in. So the idea is like, yes, you should actually, and this is where data can be helpful. One, you can show because clearly the intuition is like if the team is not doing well, then why am I partner? Not why, but like I'm less likely to partner with a team that's not doing well. But if you can show and show consistently, actually either engagement is similar, sometimes even higher. One of the examples we used for the Cubs prior to when the Ricketts bought the team and Theo Epstein came into play is that they were the lovable losers, right? So like actually television ratings seemed to go up or at least either maintained or went up when the team was losing. And like they built a whole brand, which is again is a good bit. You can obviously it's not necessarily fun if you're a fan, arguably, but at times, but it really was. I mean, the Cubs were lovable, right? And people had a really good time. And like that was something that was a unique competitive advantage in the article that we wrote for John Watt. I mean, the Dallas Cowboys, what is the definition of winning is debatable. Like, is that winning a division title? Is that going over 500? Is it performing better than you did before? Is it performing better or worse than expectation? There's a lot of real unclear of what that means. But also, like, if you have a business that is more where winning, you're kind of more inelastic to winning, where it's not changing based on when you're winning, that's a better business. And that's something that, you should be able to communicate to partners how and why value is being created.
Yeah. And also on the feels front too, when content makes you feel something versus just being memorable versus feeling like I'm thinking about like some of these more, touchy feely, and I don't use that in a negative way. Content features that teams will produce, whether it's,
Yeah.
telling meaningful stories about their players, or telling a sad or an inspiring story that may not go viral, by it's not meant to go viral necessarily, but will leave people who do take the time to watch it, leave them feeling something. Like, is there some intangible or even tangible extra value to that view? Even like someone that spends 5 minutes viewing highlights versus 5 minutes viewing a really meaningful, sentimental story.
Well, I would say probably what would happen is that you wouldn't spend 5 minutes on both pieces of content. You probably like would spend 1 minute on highlights and 5 minutes on a sentimental piece of content. And the longer somebody is watching it would make it more valuable potentially because somebody's more likely to watch it. What you would also see, and what Excel and Block 6 had was our social sentiment analysis platform, where from a negative 100 to a positive 100 basis, you could see, we could use machine learning, particularly natural language processing, to say, how positive or negative is the content itself. And you could actually give like an actual score, and then you could compare the score of those two pieces of content. And in our the revenue impact model that we developed at Excel Analytics, we did find that there was a correlation between sentiment scores and actually revenue generation. So that's one way. I'm not saying that's the only way, but that's certainly one way you could look at it. And to your original point about the difference between partnership and advertising, a sentiment score is one way. You should have a different sentiment score for partnership content than you should have for advertising content. That is one quantifiable way to show the feels, right? To say that feeling makes a difference.
Yeah.
Again, you can also talk to, I mean, to be very clear, like qualitative analysis can be and is a very important part of the discussion and should be thought of. Again, all we're trying to do is saying like what your gut instinct is probably right. Let's just create a way of systematizing it so we can say how right is it really, and if it is really right, that should be something that's communicated because that is value added. So yeah, so that's one way of looking at it. But I would say like right, you do want to as much as possible. I know this like I don't want to sound like a robot here, but like quantize, look sometimes either quantize or make a quantitative assessment of the feels.
Yeah, totally. One last thing I have for simple service stat. I swear I can keep you all day, but we'll get to simple service stat in just a moment.
Yeah.
And it's something I did want to touch on is the idea of a major athlete coming in and all of a sudden changing the equation kind of a little bit. Whether it's Son Heung-min joining Tottenham, and all of a sudden now they have a ton of fans in Korea, or Messi joining Inter Miami. Now you have fans all over the world. Or
Right.
Otani joining the Dodgers. or even in college when you have a big transfer that comes in, all of a sudden there's so much excitement. How should teams be thinking about like how does that change the equation all of a sudden of whether it's hey we have a bunch of new fans who never knew us before and now we have the opportunity to bring in new partners because these new partners get to really get at these fans, or is it a little bit of balancing of hey we are just more valuable overall now because even our existing platforms are stronger because we have a bigger reach. Like how do you start to think about that? Sometimes can be very ephemeral. When in college they're going to be gone in a
Yeah.
year. So
Right.
how's it all come to play when you're trying to maximize those opportunities?
Yeah, that's what you're talking about is part of the core reason I originally developed the revenue above replacement model, which is a somewhat, I don't even know if it's that clever anymore, a clever kind of turn, what you were
I
talking about
like
even before about the kind of pun stuff, um, on wins above replacement, which is the most commonly used metric in, or has been historically the most commonly used metric in sports in terms of evaluating player performance. Um, but I would say like what we found, or when we did those types of analysis, was that absolutely what you're saying is true. There is a bump, particularly at first and around when players are transitioning, both before that actually happens, because obviously people are talking about it, and then when it actually does happen, there is a spike in engagement. Sometimes those spikes remain, sometimes they don't, depending on the star power of the athlete. But that's one of the things you do want to quantify is what is the actual star power of the athlete, and when is the athlete being mentioned, particularly with team, if that's what you're tracking, versus potentially on its own. So right, I mean that is something you do want to, those examples that you're using are global examples. So like those clearly have a difference and make a difference and make a sustained difference. And you can see that you should be able to see that on various different metrics, whether it's, television broadcasts, like you're saying, new audiences, international viewership, um, being able to track like what you're saying, even on your on a digital perspective, having more granular detail about where people are consuming content, both locally and then globally. And one of the things you do want to be careful about is like just because a player comes from a specific country doesn't mean that country is either solely or the biggest driver of new interest.
yeah,
Lionel Messi is a global star. It doesn't mean like that. Sure, probably more people from Argentina are watching Inter Miami than before,
right,
but
right.
clearly his impact is not just because he's Argentine, right? People are interested in him because he was arguably was and still is the best soccer player in the world, right? Like that's what people care about, and that will have a global impact. So sometimes there can be this, this player comes like, particularly when it comes to soccer and when American stars go to different teams, there's like, well, now all of a sudden all these fans of America are going to be fans of this specific team. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it's not true, right? Sometimes it's like, well, actually, no, American fans care about or American sports fans care about the best teams in the world. So they're that's part of the reason the English Premier League does so well in the United States is because soccer fans want to see those teams, not
Yeah.
necessarily always American players on those teams. So it's just you just again you want to see it and want to look at the data and see what's actually happening. But yes, generally that is a good time, whether you're performing well or not, to really augment. And that's a good time if you're a brand. That is definitely when more attention or there can be spikes in attention when those kind of player transitions happen.
Yeah, and I gotta imagine ideally, even though that player is gonna eventually leave, maybe sometimes really really quickly, or maybe graduate in college, you want to hopefully have them leave with your baseline being higher than it was, before they got there.
Yeah, the only caveat again going to the point, like you don't if you set that as the expectation and the baseline is higher, then what happens when you don't hit it? So like you just there again, there's always these caveats, and that's part of the reason you maybe don't want to use a year analysis at times with Block Six or Excel. You use 1, 3, 5 year trend line, so you're not that way. You do capture a spike, but it's not the only thing you're reflecting in the course of an analysis.
Oh man, there's a whole other rabbit hole to go down with like athlete versus team
Yeah.
brand affinities as well. But I'm gonna hold my tongue because there's so much more we're gonna get to in our quick hitters, our extra credit segment. First episode shareable stat coming up right now. Just fantastic stuff with Adam Grossman. I told you, it's just a font of knowledge. So much good information. I was taking notes both physically and mentally. I hope you were too. You can listen back to that as many times as you want. There will be no test, open book only. But stick around because we're going to learn some more and have more fun getting to know Adam with our extra credit segment. But first, this episode's shareable stat. And this episode's shareable stat comes from a pretty deep dive put out a report recently put out by Morning Consult. Morning Consult always has good data to share, and this time they had a pretty robust survey of sports fans, adult U.S. Sports fans in the United States, looking at really just fandom, how they follow sports, just lots of information. But the stats I'll pull out today for the shareable stat, the first one is 34%, and that is the percentage of fans who said they are avid fans of the NFL. That's compared to 28% said they are casual fans. So super interesting to think about. Another one that we're going to go along with is 30% of MLB fans were casual. That was the only league, or the NFL was the only league where they had more avid than casual fans. Whereas if you remember that 28%, MLB actually has a higher percentage of respondents who said they were casual MLB fans than casual NFL fans. Super interesting to think about. We often think about just fans in general when we talk about digital social strategy, but how can you have to really identify and think of developing avid fans, moving those casual fans up into avid? Also, of course, trying to reach fans who are not fans at all yet, getting them into casual and moving up avid. And we talk a lot of times about developing super fans, moving fans up the fan spectrum. You oftentimes can't have an avid fan without having a casual fan first. And so if you think about these shareable stats today, the NFL has done a great job of turning their casual fans into avid fans, whereas you look at the MLB, Major League Baseball, might have an opportunity on their hands with more respondents in the survey saying they were casual fans of MLB versus casual fans of NFL, meaning that MLB can really do a lot to move those casual fans, that large cohort, nearly 1/3 of respondents in the survey, to move up into the avid fan category and get them to consume more, engage more, ultimately spend more. So super interesting to think about. If you look at your fan base, do you have an idea of even how you define avid versus casual fan, let alone how many of your fans on a given platform in general in your database are avid versus casual, and what steps can you take to not just capture new casual fans, but also move the existing casual fans into that avid category? Really interesting to think about, especially with this interview today, really getting into the weeds of data insights and how we really think about measuring success from an overall comprehensive perspective. And so we think about the shareable stats. Again, the shareable stats for this episode, 34% of respondents in the survey said they were avid NFL fans. It's the only league that they looked at, they analyzed, where they had a higher percentage of avid than casual fans. And MLB, 30% of MLB fans in the survey identified as casual, which is more than the NFL. So super interesting to think about. Check out the full morning consult report. I posted it on my LinkedIn if you want to check it out there, along with some other stats that I shared from that report, a little bit of snippets there. But more importantly, stick around, earn some extra credit, because you're going to learn a lot more and have more fun with Adam Grossman. I am back on the podcast with today's guest, Adam Grossman. He is a former founder and CEO, or always founder, but former CEO of Block Analytics, since acquired by Excel Analytics. Also, you'll find him teaching classes at Northwestern and an author of a book that we will talk about momentarily about sports strategy and insight. But Adam, you kicked ass interview. Are you now ready for a little extra credit?
Let's do it.
All right, number one. This is an interesting one because you get to, whenever I encounter young people, students or otherwise, I always try to learn from them as much as they learn from me. So tell me the most common lesson that you are instilling in your students, and also what they most taught you over the years.
Yeah. Well, the most common thing I tell students is sports industry is a very competitive industry. There's something what I like to call, which maybe is not exactly right, an information asymmetry in the interview process. You know why you're special, but nobody else necessarily knows why you're special, particularly why you're entering in the sports industry. So the quicker you close that gap and say, here's why I'm special, here's how I can help you, and here's why I would be a good hire for your company in a specific and discrete ways, the better off, the more likely you'll be successful in your industry. What I've learned about from the students is is a little like I guess idiosyncratic to me is like what they actually really care about and how that's changed over time. And like, you could think things are really important to you, or like this is really important to your business, but like really like this is how you can shape the content. Because, obviously some of the times the content that I'm talking about maybe isn't, at least on the surface, the most exciting for everybody. So like how you can, style it, create it in ways that people care and really understand what they care about has been really helpful.
Love that. Yeah, it's got to be fun. As we joked earlier, it keeps you young as well because
Yeah,
you get older, they stay the same age for the most part.
that's a good point.
Number two for you, going back to your time with the Washington Capitals. I know it was a relatively brief time, but a fun time, I'm sure. So tell me your favorite memory. It could be a game, could be whatever. It could be a player encountering a colleague, a campaign, whatever it is. Tell me your favorite memory from your time with the Washington Capitals.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely the people. Like I still talk to at least some of the people that I was working with there, and they were really great people, and they really, again, without the Capitals, I would never have gotten to where I am today. But it was really great people. And one of the things that I like the most is, and I used to joke about was we used to go to these low price lunches, and I would joke that I would take people out to low price lunches, or they would take me out to low price lunches. And there's a really good Peruvian chicken place near where the Capitals, I believe, are going to move their corporate headquarters. They just announced, I think, to downtown DC. It's currently based in Virginia, but there were some really good places around there. So that's definitely my I probably shouldn't say that, but I think the people and those life price lunches.
Love it. Yeah, and they should have a pretty exciting opportunity this coming spring and maybe next fall with Ovechkin chasing the Gretzky record. One exciting
Um,
time for the franchise, and they're kicking ass on the ice too, against all predictions. Number three for you, Adam. Tell me, you worked for the Daily Northwestern. I did some stalking on you, and so tell me the most memorable story you worked on for the Daily Northwestern. Also, you played soccer in schools. Tell me the scouting report of Adam Grossman, the soccer player.
well, I was to say on the latter part, between the two of us, we've won one collegiate soccer game. So obviously I wasn't that good. So I think I never expected to play at Northwestern. I walked on at Northwestern. I was fortunate to walk on. I had a very high goals against average. The memory I usually used to describe it is I don't know if you remember Sports Illustrated Faces in the Crowd, but
Holy.
we were playing against somebody against Indiana, and one of their players was in Faces in the Crowd. And I read about him, and then I saw him coming down on a breakaway, and I said, "This is the guy from Faces in the Crowd is about to score on me," and he did. So I think that's probably a good summary of my time at Northwestern,
Uh,
soccer-wise. Daily Northwestern, my favorite story I wrote. Northwestern had three players from the former Yugoslavia, and I wrote a kind of a feature on those three players. So that was my favorite story. Although to this day, anybody who's read it said like the lead was the best part of the story, which of course the editor wrote and not me. And I think that editor, I believe, is Adam Rittenberg, who
oh
um,
wow.
is like the ESPN, he covers the Big Ten now. But
Yeah.
that is still everybody's of people, the four people who remember it or read it, like that was their favorite part. And of course, it was the part I did not really write.
That's a fun way to try to react to that. Oh yeah, you'll love that. Thank you. I didn't write that part though.
Yeah,
Number
definitely.
four for you, Adam. Tell me your favorite brand campaign in sports and why. It can be current, can be historic, can be all
Yeah,
time.
I have to, I think, be required to say, which I also do agree with generally, is Air Jordans. And like, so David Falk was an investor in my company.
Wow.
And I think, he talked about it. And that was actually the way I got sort of connected with him is through some of the relationships, not specifically with Nike, but through Jordan's relationship actually with Wheaties and Quaker Oats. So like, I have to say that and I genuinely like, I do think clearly it is one of the most successful, if not
Oh yeah.
the most successful, licensing and IP and intellectual use of intellectual property ever. So I have to say that. But I also genuinely believe that is one of the best campaigns that's ever run. And it goes back actually to something we talked about, like organic content, right? Besides the fact that it's Air Jordan, but like clearly, like he plays basketball, it organically fits, and Nike, has obviously the best shoes, and there's a lot of great stories around it. But it actually is like one of the most effective partnerships, just like on some of the things we talked about as well.
Totally. I mean, the idea of like my favorite athlete actually helped design this shoe and like trained it and performed, and it still plays out now with signature shoes. When you know that the athlete was part of designing it, it has that much more authenticity to it. Love that example.
Yeah.
And the movie Air was pretty good too. I liked it actually.
I have some. I didn't like it as much, and I don't. Obviously the portrayal of David is
Sure.
something. Yeah,
We'll save that for the movie critique podcast.
yeah,
All
exactly.
right, number five here. Tell me, it can be anytime, all time, the most memorable game you've been at. Any
I should.
sport.
This is the when I before I started working at the Capitals. Around my birthday, they played the New York Rangers, and it was Game 7. And I was at the game. They were down 1-0, and they ended up scoring two goals in the third period. And I never have heard a crowd louder than that. And then I was going to start working in the Capitals in a couple weeks. So that was like very. And it was before, like obviously they won the Stanley Cup since then, and I didn't go to the game when they won the Stanley Cup, but then I ended up starting 3 days after they lost one of the many times they lost to the Penguins in a game 7. So I thought maybe that was going to be their year. They won that game, and I was going to work with them when they went to the Stanley Cup. But again, going back to what we talked about, obviously the Capitals had a lot of times where they thought they were going to or
Hmm.
potentially win the Stanley Cup and didn't. And having to deal with that and navigate that is something I learned directly by being an intern there.
Oh, that was a great one. That'll stick with you for sure. Next question for you, Adam. Tell me about the book you co-authored, the Sports Strategist, Developing Leaders for a High Performance Industry. You mentioned a little bit during the interview. Tell us about how the book came together and what the main things were that you and the co-authors want to get out of to folks in
Yeah,
that
I
book.
mean, amazingly, that book came out 10 years ago. The only reason I say that is I do think a lot of the core ideas, they're really a guideline, particularly for people who are entering the sports industry, but even industry professionals now and people who are looking to move forward. The idea was to create a framework in place so how you can navigate the complexity of the sports industry, whether that's from a technology perspective, and there's technologies obviously that exist now that didn't even exist when we wrote it, from a partnership perspective, from a brand perspective, from a team, how teams operate perspective, and ethical. We had an early discussion of name, image, and likeness rights that ended up actually largely coming to fruition the way that it came to fruition. Definitely not exactly, but we kind of talked about some of those things in the book. So I think it's a good. That was the idea and the framework behind it. I have some other content coming out now, and one of the things that's nice is the book helped to kind of refine my style for some of the content. You mentioned obviously John Wall Street. There's some other content that I'll be developing that will come out after this podcast releases. So hopefully people will talk about it. I can certainly talk about it when it comes out, but some other long form content. And I would say like the book became a catalyst for me to use long form content, like I mentioned before, as a way to differentiate myself in the industry.
Love that. Quick follow-up. Do you assign the book to your students in class?
Oh yeah, of course. That too.
Hell yeah.
No way, of course. That's the reason to write it. Keep royalties from all the students. No, I'm joking. We actually have, and my co-author or co-teacher of the class, who was one of my former employees, Leslie Cervantes McGreevy, she's really done a good job of integrating outside sources outside of the book into the class. And like I said, I've written chapters in other books, so we sometimes use those as well. But I would say, like, yeah, I mean, it is definitely good to have for the students to have content outside of content that I created.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, the book itself sounds like it's a perfect thing for students who are aspiring to work in sports to get to know and just give them the lay of the land, so to speak.
Yeah.
Number seven for you. I'm interested in this one. You can take this however you want, open-ended. What was the experience like of having your company acquired? Like, how's it happen? Was it high pressure? Was it really easy and smooth? Or like, what
No,
was
it's definitely not really easy. It's definitely high pressure. I mean, you know, a lot, or at least some of this, or a good chunk of it happened while, obviously COVID was in place, and that had a dramatic impact on the sports industry. Um, yeah, I mean, I think when I started the
like
company,
like,
that
like
was always
start with an email? Like, how does that even start?
actually somebody who I was talking to was just a third party who was interested in Black Six. He had heard that he had a relationship with somebody from Excel, and he said they were looking to acquire other businesses, and would you be interested in the conversation? So sometimes, I think I have to double check this, and this is just off the top of my head, so maybe it's wrong, but I think he, was consuming some of the content that I was creating either on LinkedIn or through a newsletter that I had through Block Six, and had a connection with Excel, and that was the start of it, and then. Yeah, it was a long process. There's, a lot of back and forth. But it is pretty amazing. Like even to this day, it's still pretty amazing that the company was acquired. And something right that I thought of while I was working for the Capitals, not exclusively, but sometimes at these low price lunches, it became something that got acquired. And it's nice that it's still in place. It's nice that Excel is still using Excel Analytics. And yeah, it's been a springboard for me to be successful professionally. So it is pretty amazing. I'm still, not always uh it's still amazing to think about even now, even after I've left Excel.
Yeah, your baby, and it got acquired by a really impressive company, and just
I would say, that's true. It's my baby, but again, obviously, a lot of people, particularly the employees, the
yeah,
investors, the partners. Because that is sometimes that there's this false narrative, even now when you're talking about these companies, whether it's Tesla with Elon or whatever, whatever company
yeah,
you're talking about,
all in one
it's
person.
really a lot of people. I mean, it's a shit. I don't know if you can cuss on this podcast, but a lot of people who make these things successful, and Black Six is nowhere near the size of those companies. But even that, there was a lot of people who really helped us make it be successful. And I don't even just say that like as like that's the political thing to say. That is the real thing that happened. Like it wouldn't without I couldn't have done everything on my own to make the company
Totally.
successful.
No, I can confirm, having been part of now two startups in the sports world myself. It's very much and the results are a result of the team there that's doing, not just the one
Yeah.
figurehead or two figureheads. Number eight for you, Adam. It's time for our food question. Always ask your food question. So tell me, if I go out and hang out there in the greater Chicago area with you, what's the best meal to get, and where do we get it? And also a little bonus, what is the quintessential meal for Northwestern students?
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely the wrong person to ask about this. I always have like not great food recommendations. The In terms of the quintessential meal, like what I liked at Northwestern Suits, again, which is not a popular opinion, is Giordano's, like this stuffed pizza. That was something I like and still like to this day. And when I started there, which I was actually there's a high school program. They used to have half price pizza Mondays, and that was something I used to get. Again, I don't even know if I don't think one person would agree with me on that, but that was something that I would prioritize. In terms of meals in Chicago, like in Evanston, there's a couple places in where I live now in Evanston, or at least in near Evanston. Sophia's Steak is what I think is rivals a lot of the steakhouses in Chicago. That would be one I would go to. Right now, the most famous restaurant in Chicago, and there's a lot of famous restaurants in Chicago. Chicago is an exceptional food scene, but um, one I'm really curious about because I never went to Charlie Trotter's when it was open. That was a little bit before my time, or at least I could afford going to Charlie Trotter's. But the most famous, probably chef from Chicago who started Next, and Alinea is doing like a Charlie Trotter kind of that's what his concept is for this next kind of standalone restaurant, which he does like a sequence of different restaurants. I never pronounce his name right, but his name is Grant Onchitz, or however you pronounce his last name. But he's like definitely considered one of the best chefs in the world, and he started out at Charlie Trotter's. So I would be very like that if you could get a reservation, which is very difficult to get through the Alinea like network, like that would be the one of the things I would definitely like to look into.
Very nice. All right. Well, you and me can start trying. Maybe 5 years from now, we'll
Yeah.
get a reservation.
Yeah. Well, it's not going to exist for 5 years, or at least in the way that they're doing it now. But
True.
yes,
True.
that would
Yeah.
be good to do. Yeah.
Coming down the wire here with Adam Grossman, number nine. For you, tell me your favorite. This it can be either or favorite book you've read or favorite person you've heard speak. Favorite podcast, YouTuber. Just tell us something that's really left a mark on you.
Yeah, I mean, right. There's a lot of different things I could go with. I mean, favorite podcast and kind of some of the things I'm reading probably is most currently is with Sean Carroll, and this is like not necessarily like a sports related thing. My wife and I in particular are very on a layman's basis interested in physics and ideas of physics. And Sean Carroll is probably the best public intellectual when it comes to talking about physics. And his podcast at Mindscape, and he has a series of books, many different series of books, but the most recent one is The Biggest Ideas in the Universe. So how can you like
Oh,
use a little bit of math to understand kind of like core ideas about physics and classical mechanics, quantum mechanics? It's so that's again, that's a nerdy answer. I like kind of a lot of different things and a lot of different kind of genres, and it sounds like I'm sure you do too. But like, I would say like those are like that's a just like look at something outside of sports. And I did actually write a post about one interpretation of quantum mechanics, which actually is not the one that Sean favors, and like why how it applies to the sports industry in terms of it's what's called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, and like basically how the probabilities of quantum mechanics collapse when an observer observes an action or event, and like that's how like why sports is interesting. Before that happens, there's all sorts of probabilities of
yeah.
different things that can happen, but once it's known, like then it's known and it's not as interesting. So that's why live events in sports are really valuable, is because anything could happen until when it does happen, then it's harder to make those as interesting or valuable. So it was at
Oh,
least an interpretation of Bridge the Universes, but which would be somewhat more aligned with what Sean Carroll likes. But so I'd say that's like again, if you're interested in something that's non-sports related, there's a lot of different good like business podcasts. There's a lot of different sports, business, entertainment, history stuff that I try to at least try to look at. But I would say that's a simple one, relatively simple, like at least one to think about.
I mean, shit, man. Every time I'm like sitting with anticipation before a big pitch or before even a big game starts, I'm now gonna be thinking back to this response right now. It's gonna stick with
Well,
me.
well, I would say like that's if you've watched the what was the movie that won the Oscar last year? It was Everything Everywhere All at Once. Like that's a different interpretation, which is called the Everettian interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is like all these things actually do happen in different universes. Like we're just on a specific part of the universe, and that's what we observe. So like there's some flaw, like at least from a physics perspective, not unsurprisingly with that movie, but that's probably I shouldn't say like because he does not believe in the Copenhagen or the more traditional interpretation of quantum mechanics. So I don't want you thinking about the wrong thing, at least from his perspective.
Oh, I love it. Last one for you. This is gonna be a fun one. I think. I give you the platform to write an op-ed. I mean, you get to write quite a bit, as you've mentioned already. But what is that op-ed that you want to write? What's that thing that you need to like just scream to the masses in the greater sports or data space, being like, you need to understand this. Like, what is that thing that's on your mind that you feel strongly about?
Yeah, I guess part of it is like I've written a lot of stuff that I felt strongly about. So like I don't know if there's nothing one thing on my mind.
Or it could be
If
something
I
that
were to
you
write,
already written
I
that you
say if I were to write a book, I would say like, and I mentioned this to my wife, and she would I probably shoot me if I wrote another book, but that it's about the intersection of, and there's been I think some topic about this. I haven't done enough research, but sports and religion, and that sports is effectively the new religion, and it embraces all like those. Like the stadiums are the new cathedrals, the athletes are like the new priests, like there's legends, there's like a lot of actually like really deeper religious mysticism and kind of things, and like people hoping and like literally praying for certain outcomes, and like and also like just in how religion, which still does, I'm not saying that it still does unify a lot of different communities and people from different places, like religion being the primary language that people talk about. I'd make an argument that sports is now at least one of, if not the primary language that unifies people no matter where they are. Like they can always say they're sports fans. Not saying that that isn't true, but there's a lot of parallels in like writing a book, not even an op-ed, but writing a book about sports becoming a arguably the new universal religion. So don't write it if you don't. Hopefully, doesn't somebody doesn't take it and write it themselves, or actually, please do. But that would be the one thing, like longer form topic that I would talk about.
I love it. Hey, you need to find someone
I would say the one other one I would discuss. I actually am writing a long form paper again that is coming out, that is actually coming out in a long form way.
Okay.
So I can just tease it. It's
Yeah.
about sports anchor district and mixed use facilities and their impact on sports and the sports industry more generally. So that paper is coming out. So I am actually writing about it
Oh
versus the
yeah.
sports and religion part of it.
Hey, I will look forward to both of those. It's certainly the one that's actually happening in the near term. But I mean, I just walk around find someone on Northwestern's campus who studies religion and team up with them, and you have a great book right there. I love it.
There you go.
Or
That's a good idea.
start a course, start a class there on campus as well.
Oh boy. Yeah, that's a good idea too, actually.
Adam kicked ass in the extra credit. You earned every extra credit you could. On your chance to take over the podcast for a moment and tell us your social media all-star fall. It can be whatever it is. It can be someone on LinkedIn, a blog, a newsletter, a podcast if you want. Just tell us who they are and why they're worth following.
Yeah, I mean, normally I guess what I do, I would say it's Corey. Like, Corey, John Wall Street, like he's
Oh,
always got interesting content and like things that you should take a look at. And I do think like, right, he posts a lot on X, posts a lot on LinkedIn, has his newsletter. I mean, it's just and I would say it's a little bit, I don't want to say a little bit, it's definitely different than some of the other industry publications that are out there. It takes unique perspectives, has really good experts. So I would definitely say take a look out for Corey. Not just because I write for it. I was a fan of his before I started writing for it.
I would totally echo that. If you're listening to this podcast and don't subscribe to John Wall Street, you are doing it wrong. One of my favorite reads every time it comes in the inbox. And how about you, Adam? Where can we find you as well as all your work across digital social media? Where do you want to send people?
Yeah, I do a lot of posting on LinkedIn, so that's just based on kind of what I do in my business stuff. That's a good place to find me out. Just you can look up my name, Adam Grossman, and potentially if you need Block 6 or Excel, Adam R Grossman on Twitter. Those are the primary two areas that I focus. While I do have accounts on other platforms, I don't post a lot there. So if you wanted to find me, that's the best place to find me.
Hit him up, find him on LinkedIn, follow his stuff. You'll see him occasionally writing John Wall Street as well as with other publications. We'll be looking out for more of his work. Adam, cannot thank you enough for coming on the podcast today. So much good information, so much good knowledge, so much good energy, and really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much again to Adam Grossman. Just super smart guy, really generous with his knowledge and his insight. You can keep an eye out for all of his long form content. Make sure to follow his content in John Wall Street. Follow him on LinkedIn where he's posting more and will post more of his work. Check out his book that he co-authored, The Sports Strategist, Developing Leaders for a High-Performance Industry. As we mentioned, he's also teaching the students of tomorrow at Northwestern. Just has done so much for this industry, continues to do more. I learned a lot today. I hope you did too, and we thank Adam a lot for his time and expertise today. But that'll do it for this episode of the Digital and Social Media Sports Podcast. Thanks again for listening. As always, I'm your host, Neil Horwitz. Hit me up on Twitter, NJH287, on LinkedIn also, the website, dsmsports.net, the other website, slyke.co, and of course, the podcast is available on whichever podcast platforms are favorite. Over 11 years of archives to dig through, so many good episodes, and this was a great one today. Until next time, this is Neil Horwitz signing off for the Digital and Social Media Sports Podcast.